Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for making it out here and braving the weather and all the ice. Today, we will be hearing an address from Dr. Ryan Haecker, Accusations, the legacy of the Dreyfus Affair. The Austin Union is pleased to be sponsoring this talk with the Nationalist Institute, which is a nonprofit research institute here in Austin, dedicated to the study of the intersection between philosophy and theology. As the University of Austin student-run debate society, the Union aims to pursue truth through debate and reasoned discourse, not only within the university's walls, but also throughout the local community and the wider world, as we're doing here this evening. Tonight's talk examines the Dreyfus Affair, exploring how false accusations and miscarriages of justice produce constitutional crises. For some context for those of us here who are perhaps not as familiar with the historical episode, as well as its applicability to today, here's an informative and concise excerpt from Dr. Haecker's own abstract. Quote, when the French artillery officer Alfred Dreyfus was accused of having sold French artillery plans to the German army, he was initially arrested, convicted, and imprisoned. The army discovered the true culprit, but chose to uphold Dreyfus's conviction out of fear that his exoneration would discredit the army and ultimately weaken the nation of France herself. With the leap beyond the era of printed newspapers to viral social media, accusations of alleged guilt can now be digitally replicated at light speed, relayed across the world by orbiting communication satellites, and through the liquid purchase of its algorithmic trading, concretely assembled into more vitriolic condemnations of eternal punishment. End quote. As for its background, in addition to serving as the president of the aforementioned Nationalist Institute, Dr. Haecker is also a fellow at the American Academy in Rome, an institute which is specialized in the study of the fine arts, art history, and the humanities for more than a century. He previously served as a university librarian and assistant professor of theology at the University of Austin. Dr. Haecker holds a PhD in theology and religious studies from the University of Cambridge's Peterhouse College and a master's degree in theology and religious studies from the University of Nottingham. He also holds a master's degree in information studies from the University of Texas at Austin, from where he also earned a bachelor's degree in philosophy and history. He's the author of the forthcoming book, Restoring Reason, Theology of Logic and Origin of Alexandria. Provides a theological interpretation of Origen's system of logic, and is also the co-editor of the forthcoming New Trinitarian Ontologies, a compilation of essays discussing the relationship between metaphysics and the Trinity. Additionally, he's the author of 60 academic articles. This particular lecture, which we're all about to hear, is the product of months of labor, and Dr. Haecker is perhaps the most extravagant and boisterous rhetorician I've had the privilege of witnessing. So I have no doubt that we will all find his address both intellectually compelling and entertaining, and altogether very stimulating. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ryan Haecker.
Thank you, Ryan.
Accusations, when left unexamined, easily come to be regarded as facts, and sometimes even those upon which the destinies of nations turn. For when an accusation is made, the accused is naturally held to be guilty by the public, not only of the alleged crime, but of having disturbed the peace, and, if exonerated, of having retroactively harmed the reputation of the accuser. In Sophocles' Antigone, the sister of the slain Polynices, tells the tyrant Cleon, let the dead and the god of death bear witness. I have no love for a friend who loves in words alone. I gave myself to death long ago so that I might serve the dead. When, like Antigone standing before Creon, the accuser is the sovereign of a nation, she is compelled to challenge the sovereign ruler, to publicly acknowledge their fault, their fallibility, and thereby to admit the loss of authority that sustains their power. She who is in this way accused by the sovereign thus stands paradoxically both inside and outside the political community, for to stand accused is to be held in contempt for trial by the polity. Yet to challenge the authority of the sovereign is also to stand opposed to its corporate interests, to appear less as a defendant and more like a traitor and a terrorist. When moreover the sovereign knows such accusations to be false, the accused's demand for truth and justice is regarded as the most dangerous and terrible contagion, one that threatens to delegitimize the principles of justice that uphold political rule and the entire social order. In perhaps no case is this conflict so evident as in the Dreyfus Affair. in which the Jewish French artillery officer Alfred Dreyfus was accused of treason for betraying the French army by selling the plans for a new artillery weapon to the German army. When the French army discovered the true culprit, it chose to uphold Dreyfus's conviction and exculpate the traitor out of fear that Dreyfus's exoneration would discredit the army. Ordinarily, this wanton disregard for justice would have dealt Dreyfus a death sentence. Yet he would have another chance at justice. At the height of his fame and fortune, the novelist Émile Zola published an open letter, J'accuse, to the President of France. He wrote, "My duty is to speak out, not to become an accomplice in this travesty. My nights would otherwise be haunted by the specter of an innocent man, far away, suffering most horribly of tortures for a crime he did not commit." When the army's cover-up was later exposed, the original question of the truth of Dreyfus's guilt was superseded by a far more perilous and calamitous political conflict over whether or not to imperil the legitimacy of the nation by acknowledging the army's complicity, knowingly prosecuting and then covering up the innocence of an honorable man. For nearly 5 years, France was divided between Dreyfusards, such as Charles Péguy, who believed Dreyfus to be innocent, and the anti-Dreyfusards, such as Charles Maurras, who judged that regardless of his innocence, Dreyfus should, once convicted, remain condemned so as to preserve the honor of the army and the integrity of France. Péguy famously remarked, "Tout commence in mystique et finit in politique." Everything begins in mysticism and ends in politics. The mysterious question of truth and justice was, in this tragic episode, superseded by the mundane administration of power, as the career of one man was sacrificed for political expediency to protect the supposed corporate interests of the nation as a whole. As the high priest Caiaphas says of Jesus of Nazareth in the Gospel of John, "It is expedient for us that one man should die for the people and that the whole nation perish not." When after nearly a decade of dispute, Dreyfus was at last exonerated, this affair had contributed to toppling one French government, propelling the incipient movement of European Zionism, and initiating the episodic reactions of later French fascism, which ultimately culminated in the Nazi-collaborationist regime of Vichy France. The lesson of the Dreyfus Affair has never been more urgently needed. On the eve of the 1900 Paris World Fair, at the acme of French cultural achievement, it exposed for every nation to see the deep spiritual crisis of injustice in service to politics. As Zola and Péguy so forcefully argued, the wrongful conviction of any one man, however insignificant, is a poisonous injustice that afflicts the heart of the community as a whole. The Dreyfusard movement can thus be recognized as a spiritual war to restore the mystique of Republican France, which, in an imminent overflow of the Holy Spirit, calls for a popular revolt against the mechanical logic of modern bureaucratic states that will perpetuate injustice against any one person to ensure the interests of the many or even of the few. In a Dreyfusard style, René Girard had critiqued Leo Strauss for his failure to observe how the mimetic rivalry of elites requires a scapegoat, how such a victim must be innocent to be sacrificed, and yet how the cause of this martyr for justice should also serve to invalidate the legitimacy of any governing regime. In a movement of restoration from the political to the mystical, the scapegoats of today call for a new crusade of Republican virtue to save the spirit of the law, our living constitution, and our natural rights from those who, in rewriting its letters, would twist the law against the cause of justice and continue to sacrifice the innocent upon the altar of their vanity. The idea of a constitution arises from the belief that sovereign power should be regulated by a basic written law. In The Statesman, Plato had deferred the best rule of a wise king to the second best rule of written laws, which can regulate the affairs of state even when its rulers fail to be wise. And in the Politics, Aristotle had further distinguished a constitution that establishes the arrangements of the offices of state from the ordinary law, which could be promulgated by rulers and arbitrated by judges. In the Christian Gospels, political rule is initially assumed in the nativity scene by the newborn king, to whom bow the Oriental Magi, before in the Passion narrative it is ironically renounced as not of this world, and suspended by Christ's ascension into heaven. With the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine to Christianity, political rule had expressly in Eusebius begun to be re-envisioned in the image of Christ, who, in contrast to all pagan deities, empties himself of sovereign mastery so as to be born as a child and die on the cross as a final sacrifice to cancel the rivalry that perpetuates tragic violence. Like Socrates, the trial of Jesus had reframed the rights of the accused, as a service to God and the least among us. As early as the 6th century Code of Justinian, the presumption of innocence before proven guilty was incorporated into Roman law. Since Magna Carta, this presumption has been enshrined in English common law as a right to due process, which holds that governments must prove the guilt of a defendant before punishment. Crucially, a defendant cannot be punished by the sovereign held to have committed a crime or in any way defamed as guilty before a fair and impartial trial of their peers. These rights are today enshrined in the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution. This regulation of sovereign power by law should optimally be upheld by an independent judiciary. In the spirit of the laws, Montesquieu argued that unrestricted sovereign power could only be held in check by a constitutional separation of powers, in which legislatures make the laws, judges interpret the laws, and sovereigns enforce the laws. For the sovereign to deny a citizen due process would be to violate the separation of powers, to overthrow the Constitution, and by this act to collapse the liberty of civil law into unchecked despotism. Following Thomas Jefferson's design, the United States Constitution was envisioned as a developing compact between government and the people, in which the addition of new amendments must be ratified before representatives of the people. In contrast to the French experiment that quickly reverted to Jacobin dictatorship and Bonapartist tyranny, it could not be abolished, suspended, or rewritten without popular consent and approval. Regardless of what power may allow, it must, by the principle of constitutionalism itself, be illegitimate for a constitution to be wholly rewritten without the consent of those for whom these constitutional restraints have been designed to protect. All these restraints were ultimately rooted in a shared conviction, as stated in the Declaration of Independence, that sovereignty derives from the consent of the governed, and that all humans are endowed with inalienable rights to due process as a protection for life and liberty. It is this constitutional order that a disregard for due process most radically undermines. In September 1894, French military intelligence received a crucial document from a maid spying on the German embassy in Paris. Known as Le Bordereau, the memo, this unsigned, undated note offered to deliver secret information about France's new 120mm artillery piece to the German military attaché. Faced with a clear case of treason, the War Minister, General Auguste Mercier, launched a frantic secretive investigation. With scant evidence, the inquiry quickly fixated on the Jewish captain from Alsace, Alfred Dreyfus. On the surface, Dreyfus appeared an improbable spy. He was wealthy, happily married, deeply patriotic, and had no discernible motive to betray France. Yet he was Jewish, born in Alsace, and a product of Republican meritocracy, in an army still dominated by aristocratic Catholic and often monarchist elites. On October 13, 1894, Dreyfus was arrested, accused of treason, and imprisoned, where he was offered a revolver to commit suicide. Dreyfus steadfastly maintained his innocence, declaring that he wished to live in order to clear his name. His wife, Lucy, learned of his arrest only during a raid on their house, when she was warned to remain silent lest it provoke a European war. This scandal exploded publicly on October 29th, when the virulently anti-Semitic newspaper La Libre Parallèle, founded by Edouard Drumont, announced the arrest under the headline "The Treason of the Jew Dreyfus." Other newspapers followed suit, unleashing a campaign of sensationalism and anti-Semitic rhetoric. Public opinion rapidly turned against the accused, creating a climate in which justice became increasingly difficult. The army's case against Dreyfus rested almost entirely on handwriting analysis. Alphonse Bertillon, inventor of forensic anthropometry, advanced the implausible theory that Dreyfus had practiced auto-forgery, for as the handwriting on the memo did not entirely match that of Dreyfus, the army sought to argue that he must instead have deliberately faked an imitation of his own handwriting to confuse later experts. Dreyfus's court-martial opened behind closed doors on December 19, 1894. The prosecution struggled to establish a clear motive, and several of Dreyfus's superiors testified to his competence and patriotism. Nevertheless, General Mercier illegally supplied the judges with a secret dossier containing forged and misinterpreted documents that neither Dreyfus nor his lawyer were allowed to see. On December 22nd, the military court unanimously convicted him of high treason and sentenced him to life imprisonment on the French penal colony known as Devil's Island. This island prison had previously been closed due to the high mortality rate of its inmates. Roughly 3 out of every 4 inmates died of malaria and tropical diseases. It was thus fully expected that Dreyfus would perish in prison, and had he remained in that hellish isolation, he certainly would. Before his imprisonment, Dreyfus underwent a public ceremony of degradation. His insignia were stripped from his uniform, his sword was broken, and he proclaimed his innocence before a hostile crowd that continued to shout before him, "Death to the Jews! Death to the Jews!" This, moreover, was heard in France, the first modern European nation to have emancipated the Jews during the French Revolution. During this ceremony, Dreyfus was heard to cry out, "Soldats und degrade und innocent! Vive la France! Vive l'armée! Soldiers, an innocent man is being disgraced. Long live France! Long live the army!" He was then deported to the brutal prison colony of Devil's Island off the coast of French Guiana, where he endured years of isolation chained to his bed in sweltering heat. It was perhaps only the censored letters from his wife that kept him alive during this long ordeal. The turning point in this affair came in 1896, when Lieutenant Colonel Georges Picquart became head of military intelligence. While reviewing intercepted communications, Picquart discovered a telegram addressed to Major Ferdinand Volson Esterhazy. Picquart soon realized that Esterhazy's handwriting matched that of the Bordeaux precisely. When this document was published in the French newspapers, both Esterhazy's former banker and mistress attested that its handwriting matched that of Esterhazy and not that of Dreyfus. However, when Picquart recorded his findings, the army refused to reopen the case. Fearful of scandal and damage to their institutional authority, they transferred Picquart to Tunisia and later even imprisoned him. Meanwhile, Major Hubert Joseph Henry forged additional documents, the now infamous Thou Henry, to reinforce the army's case against Dreyfus. However, after Esterhazy was acquitted by the army in a sham court-martial, Émile Zola published his explosive open letter, J'accuse, in L'Aurore, directly accusing the army and the government of conspiracy. The piece sold 300,000 copies in a single day, electrified France, and elevated the Dreyfus Affair into the defining political struggle of their generation. This was perhaps the first and greatest instance of the press holding politicians accountable for a miscarriage of justice. However, for his courage, Zola was prosecuted for libel, forced into exile, and later murdered by his own chimney sweeper, who, on his deathbed, confessed to having blocked Zola's chimney to asphyxiate France's most celebrated novelist in his sleep. In 1898, War Minister Godefroy Condillac sought final proof of Dreyfus's guilt. Yet on the evening of August 13th, an anti-Dreyfusard officer in Condillac's cabinet noticed that the paper of the Thou Henry had been glued together in a clumsy attempt at forgery composed of 3 separate pieces of paper, with the incriminating pieces affixed to the genuine handwriting of Dreyfus. Condillac confronted Colonel Henry. After about an hour of questioning, Henry broke down and then confessed to forging the document to bolster the case against Dreyfus. Henry was arrested and committed suicide the next day by slitting his own throat with a razor. This revelation forced the Supreme Court to order a retrial. In 1899, the Rennes court-martial unfolded amid siege-like tension. There were anti-Jewish riots throughout France, pistol duels in the streets, and even Dreyfus's lawyer, Ferdinand Laborie, was gunned down on the steps of the courthouse by an anti-Dreyfusard extremist. Yet again, the army upheld the conviction, and Dreyfus was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Zola's open letter had, however, lit a firestorm of international controversy. English and American newspapers began to follow every anecdote of this story. Even in Tsarist Russia, France was lampooned for the palpable hypocrisy of its failure to uphold the ideals of the Republic and the French Revolution. Thus it was that, on the eve of the 1900 Paris World Exhibition, as the Eiffel Tower was yet rising on the River Seine, the new president of France offered Alfred Dreyfus a pardon. Exhausted from so many years of torment, Dreyfus reluctantly accepted a presidential pardon in September 1899. After nearly 5 years in prison on Devil's Island, Dreyfus's health had visibly deteriorated. His hair had turned gray, his teeth were falling out, he had lost much of his ability to speak. He feared that a subsequent prison sentence could lead to his death. He thus reluctantly accepted a pardon to spare his life and allow him to return to France again as a free citizen. Yet in tacitly accepting his guilt, he would thereafter be judged by anti-Dreyfusards to have been guilty of the accusations, and ironically even by the Dreyfusards, his supporters, to have betrayed his own cause of defending Republican liberty. The Dreyfus Affair thus appeared in without final verdict. It ignited a frenzy of animosity that fizzled out without apparent result. It also revealed that even in Republican France, prejudice against the Jews persisted in the press and in public riots. These divisions contributed to chronic instability and economic crises, which continued to weaken trust in French institutions and hampered their responses to German rearmament. The Dreyfus Affair's most tragic consequences were evident in Vichy France. After the 1940 German defeat of France, Vichy France enacted anti-Semitic laws, deporting over 70,000 Jews to death camps. In fact, Dreyfus's beloved granddaughter was a resistance fighter against Nazi German occupation. When she was arrested and identified as the granddaughter of the famous Jew Dreyfus, she was deported to be murdered in the death camp of Auschwitz. Pro-Vichy writers and officials recalled the Dreyfus Affair to discredit the Third Republic, amplify anti-Semitism, and justify collusion with the Nazis. Yet long before the Nazis, the Dreyfus Affair had also sparked the origins of Jewish Zionism. Observing Dreyfus falsely accused of treason convinced Theodor Herzl that anti-Semitism was an inescapable social condition of Europe, and that the only answer to anti-Semitism was for the Jewish people to possess their own sovereign state. The persecution of Dreyfus spurred him to publish Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State, in 1896, and organized the first Zionist Congress in 1897, which later culminated in the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. These long-term consequences of the Dreyfus Affair continue to shape the world today. For all of its feverish convulsions, the cause of Dreyfus appeared to have been frustrated at its abortive finale. It had first condemned only to thereafter pardon Dreyfus, yet without conclusively demonstrating either his guilt or establishing his innocence. The subsequent French Supreme Court exoneration could then is now be judged by anti-Dreyfusards to have been as compromised by political interest as was his initial conviction. The higher mystical question of whether or not he was truly guilty was in this way superseded by the more mundane political question of whether or not it was in the interest of this or that party to narrate the story of this trial for or against Dreyfus. The hidden truth of his culpability, a truth that perhaps only he and God could know, had thus been exposed to the judgment of the world in a forensic scrutiny that would define his legacy for all time. It is, however, in the higher light of eternity that the Dreyfus Affair casts a shadow of theological significance, principally in the writings of Charles Péguy and Charles Maurras. On the one hand, Péguy judged that even if Dreyfus was guilty, he should, as a martyr for the Republican mystique, be defended because the defense of Dreyfus elicited the courage to defend the Republic. On the other hand, Maurras judged that even if Dreyfus was innocent, he should, having once been convicted by the army, still be condemned to uphold the honor of the army and the integrity of France. In condemning Dreyfus, in spite of his possible innocence, Maurras held the interests of politics to supersede the hidden or mystical truth of his alleged guilt. Yet in championing Dreyfus, in spite of his equally possible guilt, Péguy recalls the higher theological calling of jurisprudence, in which, from Aeschylus's Orestia to Victor Hugo's Les Misérables, the judgment of the courts is a blind mirror of divine judgment in expectation of its eschatological fulfillment. Charles Péguy was a French poet, essayist, and editor known for his unique blend of fervent socialism, intense nationalism, and Roman Catholic piety. He founded the influential journal Notebooks of the Fortnight. In his essay of that journal, Our Youth, in 1910, Péguy recalls the Dreyfus Affair as the last Republican movement, the supreme effort of that heroism, of that mystique, the last manifestation, the last revelation. It was, he insists, not primarily a juridical or political episode, or even simply a struggle over anti-Semitism or military injustice. It was, in a more profound way, the last great manifestation of the Republican mystique, a moment when the Republic still lived as a spiritual faith, rather than as merely the engine of our collective interests. This Republican mystique is, Péguy contends, the same as France's older Christian mystique, the mystical prayer of St. Denis, later identified with Dionysius the Areopagite. But whether in the trial of Jesus or Dreyfus, the cause of justice, when someone is wrongfully accused, demands the total devotion of death of those brave souls who, in taking up the cross, willingly renounce their own lives for the sake of their neighbor. In double contrast to the mutual opposition of Christian royalism and secular republicanism, Péguy observes a parallel loss of both the Christian and the Republican mystique. He writes, the de-republicanization of France is essentially the same movement as the de-Christianization of France. Both together are one and the same movement, in which people no longer believe in the Republic and no longer believe in God. For he continues, one and the same sterility withers the city and Christendom, the political city and the Christian city, the city of man and the city of God. In an advance beyond the long 19th century of France's oscillation between monarchy and democracy, He calls us to an entirely different plane of metapolitical analysis. The quarrel is not, he argues, between the old regime and the revolution. The contest is not between heroes and saints. The fight is against the intellectual, against those who despise heroes and saints equally. The whole point, he writes, is that in each order, in each system, the mystique should not be devoured by the politique to which it gave birth. The historic betrayal of political Dreyfusardism can in this way reveal the hidden glory of what Peggy designates as mystical Dreyfusardism. In the Dreyfus Affair, he writes, the real traitor is the man who sells his faith, who betrays his mystique, and who enters into his corresponding politique. The policy issuing from it and the complacency passes over the dividing point, where politics devours mysticism. Yet, as we observe in the superpolitical sacrifice of Émile Zola, the mystical Dreyfusards are men of heart who have sacrificed their careers twice, their futures, their existence, their bread, first of all to fight against the enemies, and second time to fight against their friends. The Dreyfus Affair was, Peggy observes, a crisis in three histories. For the Jews, it was a crisis of Jewish assimilation to European nationalities. For France, it was a crisis of Republican jurisprudence under military authority. And yet for Christians, it was above all a supreme crisis to escape from what Max Weber had characterized as bureaucratic rationality, and what Henri Bergson had characterized as the closed morality to follow the example of Zola and the saints, to sacrifice their own lives for that of a stranger. There is, Peggy claims, no doubt whatsoever as far as we are concerned. The Dreyfusist mystique was not only a particular instance of the Christian mystique. For Christians, as for the Republic, the justice and the truth which we have loved so much, to which we gave everything, our youth, to which we gave ourselves completely during the whole of our youth, were not an abstract conceptual justice and the truth. They were not a dead justice and a dead truth found in the books in the libraries, the justice and the truth of the intellectual party. They were organic, Christian in no modern sense. They were eternal and not temporal only. They were justice and truth, a living justice and a living truth. Between the wars of Napoleon and Hitler, France had fought a spiritual war between the mystical Dreyfusards and the proto-fascistic anti-Dreyfusards. The cause of the Dreyfusards was not, as their name suggests, simply that of Alfred Dreyfus. Rather, it was a French crusade to recover the heroic mystique from the inhuman automation of conscientious choice under the totalizing dominion of politics. The question, Peggy claims, was never whether Dreyfus was innocent, but whether people would have the courage to declare to know him to be innocent. It required, he insists, a double courage. First, the outward courage to proclaim him innocent publicly, to risk everything, one's whole life, in fact, everything. Second, the secret courage to give up one's peace of mind for the sake of that man, the supreme good, the only good. Peggy thus believed that the Dreyfus Affair was not just a political question, but was instead of inescapable religious concern for a wayward republic, one that could not be reduced to the interests of one party or another, and one that required a higher mysticism to save the republic. What he witnessed in Émile Zola's open letter, J'accuse, was such an exemplary act of Republican martyrdom. For in deliberately inviting a lawsuit for libel that led to his trial, imprisonment, and eventual murder, Zola had shown that he would risk everything and even give his own life for the plight of a stranger whom he did not know, simply because it served the higher cause of justice that transcends the momentary interests of a party, an army, or a nation. To allow for an innocent man to be wrongfully punished would corrupt the entire nation, yet to offer one's own life in his place would honor God by honoring justice. For in serving the stranger, we serve all, even those for whom this service is scandalous. At the center of this debate stands the question of justice. Is justice something that we can simply disregard when it no longer proves expedient? Should we give up on justice when it no longer serves to promote the integrity and army of the nation, or even a reputation that we might otherwise wish to display? Or should we have the courage to recognize our own culpability when we fail to uphold those principles, when we wrongfully accuse someone, and when we deny them due process to defend their honor and their innocence? And if so, we must be willing, as Peggy recognized, not only to allow for the reputation of a political community to be tarnished, but perhaps even to sacrifice our own welfare, even our own lives, for this higher cause that transcends all particular and national interest. Today we observe a growing collusion between techno-oligarchy and national populism. The old establishment of center-left and right neoliberalism, which had simply exchanged one side of liberalism for another, and in so doing advanced the technical agenda of finance capitalism, has lately been superseded by a more naked display of brute realpolitik, in which power tends to break the cord of all disagreement. In this arena, we can observe what Oswald Spengler had warned of the rise of Caesarism, in which an elite turned demigod seizes power within a decaying civilization, only to beget an ever greater concentration of sovereign wealth and power. The question of justice is today one of permanent danger. We observe an escalating symbolic rivalry, one dubbed by René Girard as mimetic rivalry, in which elite competition to surpass one's peers in tokens of prestige cannot enjoy final satisfaction. For in every movement of surpassing, another contest emerges, where, however, the resources for its realization become ever more scarce. The only way, then, to overcome this competition is to conjure an escape mechanism, which allows for this rivalry to be momentarily suspended. This is what Girard famously described as the scapegoat mechanism. When the contest of mimetic rivalry boils over, it must be cancelled by casting the blame for its failure upon a scapegoat. Ostensibly, this victim of elite competition abjectly suffers the violence of the whole political community. Yet as his later writings increasingly reveal, if we regard this scapegoat as simply disposable, lacking all right to fair due process, then we continue to uphold the interests of politics, wherein this rival's agony becomes inescapable. To dispose of the scapegoat without due process is only to reinforce the cause of this rivalry. As Peggy had argued against Maras, when we elevate politics above the mystique of justice, we only succeed in undermining the political by betraying the mystical. When pursued for its own sake, politics proves to be not only self-destructive, but ultimately self-defeating. The political can, to the contrary, only be sustained by pursuing it in such a way that is super-political, mystical, that is, by theology. To protect the scapegoat with constitutional due process is the only way to protect our shared political interests. We must, for this purpose, recognize the quiet nobility of Dreyfus and all those who have been wrongfully punished. Dreyfus was not extraordinary. He was understated. He was humble. He was polite and punctual, even to the annoyance of his peers. He was simply an ordinary man placed in extraordinary circumstances. Yet in those circumstances he was called to uncommon valor, for which his service as an artillery officer will be forever overshadowed. He was called to play the role of a hero and a martyr by upholding the cause for justice that was not of his own choosing. As Peggy acutely observed, his sacrifice of his freedom, his welfare, and his reputation would forever serve the higher cause of justice, even the eternal salvation of France.
So with that, I'd like to briefly say, many of you will have come here hoping to hear about justice in France and elsewhere, and there are many of you who may know that there has been great injustice done to the world, and even in our community. I would like to acknowledge one person here who has suffered terribly and has upheld the honor of his community with the utmost integrity. And so if you will join me, please give your hands of applause to Christoph Jacobs. And with that, we'll hand over to Morgan Marietta to offer his response.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me there. I would love to be in Austin with you tonight. To everyone I know from last year, it's great to see you. For those who have arrived this year, you may have heard my name mentioned. Just to set a rumor to rest, it is not true that Pano Canellas sent me to Devil's Island. As the song goes, I'm alive and well in Tennessee, though all of my ex-employers are in Texas. As far as I remember, I was the first to leave by choice rather than by exile. I might come back one day, but only if I get a bust larger than Pano's. And since there's not a lot of stone left available, I don't think that's going to happen. So probably not. So there are several people there that I am proud to have been associated with. Just to name a few: Ryan, Christoph, Armand, Milo. McKenna Conlon is a person of substance. And there are several other people, of course, that I should mention. But this is on video, so I will not tarnish their reputations with my praise, but they have earned it. So I'll just say a few words about what Ryan presented, especially in relation to what I care about, which is university constitutionalism. One of the reasons I came to UATX was to establish university constitutionalism, and one of the reasons I left is that it had failed. I think Ryan is correct that the Dreyfus Affair tells us a great deal about this. I'm proud that when UATX decided to falsely accuse some people, we picked Gentiles. Unlike the usual pattern, the Jews were left alone. I see this as generational improvement over the Dreyfus Affair. I'm proud that we merely went after a Catholic rather than a Jew. It does my heart good. So now let me talk about what I am not proud of. A wise man told me once to never say more than 3 things at a time. So I'm going to say 3 things as quickly as I can. Why constitutionalism failed at UATX, why constitutionalism is needed, especially at UATX, and how you might restore it. All of these relate to a social science concept of the dog that didn't bark. Scholars most of the time explain things that they see, but some of the most important things are often the ones that are missing. They're harder to recognize. In the Dreyfus case, one of the questions is why more people didn't stand up for him. I'm going to say something about that. And it applies to constitutionalism, because you see, without constitutionalism, there are a lot of dogs that won't bark, good dogs. And it's harder to see that, because you have to understand that they would have said things if constitutionalism had been there. So now, first of all, it occurs to me that some of you there might not be entirely familiar with what happened at UATX. So let me give you a quick rendition. A student was accused of wrongdoing and expelled. That was on the first day of class. A professor was accused of wrongdoing and fired. That was at the end of the first term. I was heavily involved in both of those cases. And I can tell you without hesitation that I don't believe either one of them did it. They did not do what they were accused of doing. Each of them was denied due process. Both of those cases went to the adjudicative panel. The adjudicative panel ruled in their favor in both cases and ordered reinstatement. And the university ignored the court's ruling and did not follow them. Even I didn't see that coming. I actually thought that the university would follow the court's rulings, but they did not. The board then changed the Constitution to remove these sorts of protections. And now, under the existing Constitution, if someone is accused, there's no hearing, there's no jury, there are no rights to speak of. The faculty are essentially at-will employees, and the students are subject to concentrated power, the opposite of constitutionalism. If any of this surprises you, or you didn't actually know some of this, one of the crucial facets of constitutionalism is its public nature. If the controversies and the rulings of the court are hidden, if they're secret, it's impossible for power to be constrained, and it's impossible for a constitutional order to work. One of the saddest things to me was when the board started to amend the Constitution without telling anyone. The Constitution wasn't given the respect, at least, to amend it rather than just erase and add. There's no such thing as secret or hidden constitutionalism. So why did it fail? Why did constitutionalism fail at UATX? Because constitutionalism is hard. We assume because it succeeded with the United States Constitution that it's simple, but even that was a very long road, and there were many violations early on. Constitutionalism failed at UATX because it requires admitting that you are wrong. It requires admitting errors. And there are 2 types of people who don't like to admit that they're wrong. One is academics. We are an arrogant people. And the other one is billionaires, because they don't have to. And at UATX, we combined the 2. And that made constitutionalism especially hard. So why was Dreyfus on the island for so long? Because releasing him would have required people in power to admit that they were wrong, and people in power don't do that. Now, I understand it. UATX has always had, from the beginning, a defensive posture. It has many enemies. And some leaders really wanted to be constitutional, but they thought that our enemies would exploit it, and they thought it would do too much damage. So they said, let's hide the errors for now. We can be constitutional later. To coin a phrase, Lord, give me constitutionalism, but not yet. And that prayer applies to a lot of things. But power is like sin. It doesn't stop making demands. If you don't do the right thing now, the time will not announce itself later. And the board then abandoned constitutionalism as a whole. And I think that was the great mistake. The reason constitutionalism failed was ego. So why is it needed? Let me say a quick word about Albert Einstein. There's a famous quote of his. He was a famous constitutionalist. And he said, the right to search for truth implies also a duty. One must not conceal any part of what one has recognized to be true. That was the great idea of UATX, that people would not hide things at all. They would speak openly. Most universities suffer from constant concealing of the truth. They don't talk about controversial things. They will not depart from expected opinions. Faculty will not present evidence which is not welcome. They conceal a great part of what they believe to be true. And UHX was meant to be different, but it will not be without constitutional protections. For those of you who have not been faculty, the Constitution was meant to replace the tenure system. It was meant to provide a better protection of academic liberty. But if faculty don't have tenure, or they don't have a constitution, they simply won't speak their mind because they're afraid of offending Barry. They're afraid of offending Neil. They're afraid of offending Joe. They're afraid of offending the board. A lot of dogs will not bark if the Constitution is not there. And you may not notice it right away because the faculty will say things, but then you won't know what they are not saying. And the same is true of the students. The students will eventually not bark. They'll bark a little bit more because students have always had more courage than faculty. But the other dog you won't hear is the faculty who won't go there. Without tenure and without constitutionalism, some faculty will leave, but many will not come at all. Because a university without real protection of academic liberty is merely a think tank with students. It's not a university. So let me end by saying how it might be restored. My greatest piece of advice to you all is to hire famous people. The lesson of the Dreyfus Affair is the role of Zola. Imagine the whole thing without Zola having been there and his courage. You wouldn't be talking about it and we wouldn't know about it. UATX didn't have Zola. You need them. Now, have you asked yourself why there are no truly famous faculty at UATX? With all the money, with all the reputation, why are there not famous faculty? There are a lot of famous speakers, but none of them are permanent faculty. Now, no one take insult, please. I'm not saying that the faculty who were there are not, good, but they're not famous, and neither am I. Now, last year, I brought several famous people to the university to hire them, and they said no every time. Why? Because famous people are hard to control. Famous people will speak. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to hire them. I wanted people like Zola around. And that's one of the reasons why the first president vetoed all the famous people, because he didn't want anyone he couldn't control. I encourage you to talk to the current leadership about hiring some famous people. They will not be able to control them, and that will be good. Because in the end, constitution requires two things. It requires honesty and it requires courage. And the older I get and the grayer my beard becomes, the more I recognize how rare those two things are. And they're really the same thing. courage and honesty. And if UATX had more of it, it would be a much better place now. Last thing I'll say is all of my life, people have thought that it wouldn't be them. Don't think it. My last piece of advice to you is don't think it won't be you. It'll be you. You might be accused. And if it happens, some people will stand up for you and some will not. And you will learn some things about people. But even if you aren't accused, ever, it will still be you. You will be the victim of the death of constitutionalism because you won't hear what a lot of faculty would have said. You will not hear what a lot of students would have said. And you won't hear from a lot of faculty who would have been there. Think of all the things you could have heard, but you will not. All those dogs who won't be barking. I'm proud to have tried constitutionalism there. It may be a lost cause, but maybe not. Maybe not yet. So I'm told I should ask Ryan a couple of questions. Let me end with two I'd like to hear him talk about. Two things struck me as he was speaking. The first one, Ryan, is that you mentioned about the connection of Platonic thought and Straussian thought and the possible tension between Platonic thought and Straussian thought and constitutionalism. Evan Mandery mentioned this in Politico, though he didn't fully explain it. Is he right? Is it actually true that UATX has a fundamental problem because there are too many Platonists and Straussians, and a Platonist Straussian university simply can't be a constitutionalist one? Is he right about that? And is that actually the root of the issue? It comes down to ideas all the way down. And the second question I'd like you to talk about, to me, Zola is the hero, of course, and the really interesting figure, the one who's really hard to understand. And my question is this: how do we encourage more people at UATX to be as foolish as Zola?
Thank you, Morgan. These are brilliant remarks, and I'm so excited to have you offer your words of wisdom one last time, perhaps not the last time for the students here. So I do think that it's true that in a university can be characterized by one living or dead author. I also don't know that there is a ponderant majority, or even a decisive majority of political theorists or professors who are associated with or under the influence of Leo Strauss. What I will say is that among the professors, there is at least a constellation of thinkers who have been influenced by either Leo Strauss or graduate programs that have been taught by his students and proteges in the past. And because of that, because it's a live topic of controversy, both decades past and continuing in the present, people often focus on this and see a kind of signature of his thought that is carried through and echoed with the voices of current faculty. And so without attempting to defame anyone in particular or any school of thought, I would argue that there is a fundamental tension, in fact, between Platonic philosophy and the thought of Leo Strauss, which often goes under the name of Socratic philosophy, that is to distinguish Socrates from Plato. And the principal reason for this is, I believe, as I also understand the contemporary reception of Plato, his living school of tradition that he founded at the Academy, continuing through the early, middle, and late Platonism, all the way up through the new Platonic school of Athens in the 6th century, and even continuing through the Islamic, Christian, and Jewish traditions that interpreted it, that Plato was a metaphysical thinker. He believed in a hierarchy of forms descending from the first principles through the diffusion of them, through modes of dyadic multiplicity, through most generic kinds, down through paradigms and their various instantial manifestations. And in doing so, he also believed that the gods could be known by our understanding of the ideas themselves and the way by which we structured their relation in a hypothetical form of thought that was ultimately grounded in its own hypostatic form of self-manifestation. And this was a belief that was advocated by figures like Plotinus, by Proclus, and then carried through by figures like Porphyry, Victorinus, Augustine, from Augustine to all Latin Christianity, through Dionysius and Maximus the Confessor, through all Eastern Christianity, and then to the medieval scholastics, and all the way up to present day. Now, key to this is that there is a way by which we can know truth itself through the study of first philosophy, metaphysics. That is the study of what can be known of being qua being, and the way by which it proceeds from those principles into intelligible forms of reality that give an internal understanding to what things are and how they can be known, that is the essence of things and their very subsistent constitutions. With all that being said, I believe that Plato was firmly committed to the belief that truth could be known and that justice was served by knowing the truth and acting upon it. And that the story of Socrates, his trial and his death, should be understood in that light, that he dies not for political expediency. If he wanted political expediency, he could have left the prison cell. He had people who were willing to help him escape. If he wanted to be a tyrant, he could have followed the way of Alcibiades. He could have taken control of Athens, just like Alcibiades had. But he decided to die for the image of the philosopher, the life of the philosopher who lives for truth rather than for profit and expedience. And in doing so, he gives us an image of how it is we ought to serve justice and the ends of virtue of our own soul that is true to itself, rather than serving the interests of the political party or our own power. And I think that stands in direct contrast to any view of philosophy that endorses a noble lie or that regards political power as predominant and sacrifices metaphysics to the altar of that power that it can instrumentalize through various rhetorical means. Now, there's a lot to be said about the thought of Strauss himself and his successors. I don't know that we can quite go into that, but if we like, we can discuss that. I myself have a radically different interpretation of Plato, and I see that as more consonant both with the Christian tradition, with the story of the Gospels, as well as the way by which it's been received ever afterwards, and explicitly in figures like Charles Péguy, who saw in the Dreyfus Affair a Socratic moment, whereby we have to choose whether truth can be known and justice should be followed in fighting for it.